DEI used to be a LinkedIn buzzword. Then it became a budget line, and then it became controversial. So the real question is, where are we actually now? I'm your host, Kate Noel, SVP of Head of People Operations here at Morning Brew Inc. And today on People Person, we're talking about what the data says about DEI in today's workplace, what leaders are prioritizing and what they're pulling back on, and of course, what employees are actually experiencing. First, I'm going to be joined by Kristen Parisi, who's our senior reporter here at HR Brew, and who covers the latest DEI survey results and has the tea on what the numbers really reveal. Then we're bringing in Latesha Byrd, who is the CEO and DEI consultant at Perfeqta, and she will be breaking down what this means in real organizations. One place to confidently manage your team and your business? Yes, it actually does exist. This summer, QuickBooks Payroll is expanding to support how businesses hire, onboard, manage, and retain their teams, all connected to their books. Businesses will be able to hire and onboard employees directly inside QuickBooks, manage HR documents, policies, and workflows in one place, and track time off, performance, and benefits alongside payroll. Talk about the whole package. It's payroll, HR, and accounting designed to work as one system for improved efficiency and better decisions. So no more duplicate data entry, syncing between vendors, or learning yet another brand new platform. Learn more and get started at quickbooks.com/workforce. That's quickbooks.com/workforce. Kristen, it's so good to have family here on the show, and I'm so thankful that you're here for the conversation.
Hi, Kate. Happy to join.
Happy to have you. So look, I know what the survey is all about, but for the people in the back, why don't you give us a quick recap on what the premise of the survey is and why would it be so important for us today?
Very, very simply, we wanted to understand how DEI is changing, or perhaps even not changing all that much, especially given the last coming up on 2 years now of real pushback by certain folks outside of the industry.
Gotcha. Oh, any examples of some questions that were asked during the survey, themes possibly that you could share?
Yeah, so we asked folks how their DEI strategy has changed, where their priorities have changed, if they are still sticking with certain aspects. So we really wanted to understand kind of across the board how things are changing. I think one of the more interesting things was that only 1 in 5 folks said, hey, we're changing, or sorry, DEI is not going to be any priority moving forward. But on the flip side, right, that means that 80% of respondents said that at least in some way, shape, or form, DEI is still going to be a priority for them in the future.
That's amazing. And just knowing the landscape of the things that are going on right now, to hear 1 out of 5 is not a priority is interesting. But I'm curious to know why for you that seemed to have been a surprise that it wasn't a priority for them, just based on those results.
Well, so I think it's really, really hard to know what's going on in somebody's head, right? To understand where these respondents are coming from. Um, I think even HR professionals who may not touch on these things every day may be influenced perhaps by some of the messaging that's happened around DEI. And so maybe there's not the most full-fledged understanding of what goes into DEI policies, right? They can look at their program and maybe say, yeah, we don't have a DEI team, so it's not a priority for us. Or, oh, we don't have employee resource groups, so it's not a priority for us. But then I think, and we'll get into this in a moment, but those more tactical parts of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs are where we see folks, oh, we're still doing the work. Maybe we don't call it that, but the work is still happening.
Gotcha. And just for a clarification point, this survey was asked to strictly HR folks, or were they people HR adjacent? Would just love to know what made up the makeup of the audience.
Yeah, pretty much a majority of folks identified as some some HR function.
Talking a little bit about the results, it sounds like one of the things that kind of stood out to you was the 1 out of 5, but then thankfully there's an 80% that's still, pushing forward with the course of having DEI in the workspace and having it be a priority to some degree. But were there other results that stood out to you that you definitely felt were worth mentioning, highlighting, and maybe tell a story that we possibly wouldn't have seen beyond the survey?
Yeah. So, nearly 60% of folks, I think it was 59%, said that they haven't changed their DEI programming at all. I think that's interesting because, if anyone watched President Trump's recent State of the Union, he claimed that his administration has ended DEI across the board. And what we're seeing, not just from our data, but really data across the board, is that's just not true. The language may change, but the sentiment is still the same. I don't know if that's necessarily surprising, but it is really interesting and maybe something for people to keep in mind. We also saw that folks, around 35% of respondents said that they had changed their language. That's not also not a huge shock to us. HR Brew's own analysis found that since President Trump won re-election, over half of Fortune 100 companies have changed their DEI programs in some way, shape, or form, even if it's just the language.
How interesting. And I'm assuming the language change is being done for a very specific reason, and perhaps it's to still be able to have the work done without possibly blowback by the actual words being titled a certain way, or am I looking at this the wrong way?
Nope, you're making a really good point. 60% of folks who said that they had changed their DEI strategy directly pointed to the current administration as that reasoning. I think we've talked to a lot of lawyers about this and just the risk that could be associated with that language. It doesn't mean that they're doing anything illegal. We have not heard in the courts, like the courts say the words diversity, equity, and inclusion are illegal, right? So it's maybe just trying to say, hey, we want to do this a little bit quieter, a little bit more in the background. Some scholars call it diversity hushing. I call it DEI on the DL.
That's good. That's real good.
A lot of folks, I think, and there's still a debate within the industry, right? Between HR leaders, DEI professionals, there's still this ongoing debate of what language do we use? Do we still use that DEI language and say, hey, we know that like if we let go of the language, are we also letting go of some of what's behind that intent? Or do we say, you know what, let's not hold on to the words so much because the work is still being done?
Gotcha. Are there
And I
like
don't have the answer. I don't know what's right.
I don't think either of us do. And to be honest, this is like such uncharted territory because I don't think we've ever seen a situation like this in such like a mainstream conversation where it's like, before we just were really on the side of like DEI is so important. Let's put funding behind it. Like we need to show everyone that we care. And then we just swung the complete opposite way where it's like, actually, never mind. Let's be hush about it. Oh, obviously, there are some companies who still are standing 10 toes down on what it is that they believe to be important about inclusion and diversity and equity. But it's just so wild just to see the whiplash within the span of 10 years almost, you can even say 10, 15, if my math is correct. And so, I don't think anyone has the right answer, but there's a moral compass when it comes to like how to handle these things in a way that speaks to the humanity of people in the workplace. So that's interesting to see. I was actually going to ask you, seeing that there are quite a few companies who are DEIing on the DL, as you said, what are the like normal words that are being used or like titling then that's replacing DEI in those functions, but the work is still being done? Have you noticed trends about what's being utilized in that way?
Yeah. So I think Disney is a great one to point to. They use a lot of belonging language. We've seen and we saw that belonging language come into play back in 2022. We saw that word kind of creeping up more and more. Now folks are really leaning into the belonging aspect. Culture and inclusion is another big one that we've seen. Inclusion and fairness, right? Because talk a lot about and hear a lot about, well, are your hiring practices fair? And
Mm.
that I think that's something that everyone can agree on is that we all want to work in fair places.
Absolutely. And fair by definition needs to also be sure to be explained because different people can have different definitions of that. But I think the fact that people are interested in even knowing that's the direction we want to move in is like super important. So fair definitely is at the top of the list. Now, for the companies who are still doing DEI for their businesses, are you seeing that they're still tying it to business outcomes or are they making it marked as optional?
No, that I mean, tying things not only to business outcomes, but also to, executive compensation, which we saw a lot of that oh my God, it's 2026. We saw that a lot of that. It's about six
Crazy.
years ago.
Yeah, time is
Um,
flying.
It really is. But now, we saw folks start to step away from that back in end of 2022, early 2023, when the economy started to shift a little bit. And folks did start to step away from those resources just from a budget perspective. So that's one thing that's really going away, tying it to executive compensation. And I've heard across the board, it's something that's can feel a little risky, can maybe lend to maybe not the best practices always. So, really looking at specific tactics instead and see how those lead to outcomes.
I see. Based on the survey that you conducted, or the team did at the very least, are there different creative ways in which people are approaching DEI that perhaps weren't taken into consideration before? Are there ways that like are revealing different trends or themes that, perhaps will be helpful to anyone who's listening or watching our conversation today?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it like straight from the data, but I would just say like overall, the lawyers say that a lot of companies hold on to certain DEI practices because it's deemed legally risky not to. So, and this is where our data does come into play. There are certain practices that are more common, things like pay equity reporting, even if it's not being done publicly, making sure that they're tracking that internally. That makes sure that there's not huge gender disparities, right? If you and I were at the same level and I was a man, I shouldn't be making 40 grand more than you potentially, right? So making sure that pay is fair, assessing hiring practices to make sure that practices aren't biased. Those types of things can help companies protect themselves from potential legal risk. And we have seen that in the data that they are more likely that companies are more likely to have these practices.
Gotcha. So, Kristen, as like a final thought, like being the person that has like gone through all of the data, you've sat with it, you're obsessed with it, relatable content, twins in that regard. Seeing kind of like where things are now, we've experienced it ourselves, seeing where DEI was like at the top of the mountain, and now I don't even know how we would define where things are now. How would you summarize the state of DEI based on the survey that you received, and how would you share that with others?
I think it's evolving.
Hmm.
And I don't think that I mean, I don't think that folks should negative necessarily view things as a negative. It's always been evolving from the affirmative action days, right? And when we saw President Reagan go after affirmative action in the 1980s and companies pushed back against him, things have constantly evolved to where we are now. So now I think companies are looking at, okay, what's next? And things like those pay equity reporting, assessing for biases, making sure that they are keep their employee resource groups. All of those things can help companies make sure that they have fair and inclusive places to work, which I think everybody would want because it helps them attract and retain talent, which is ultimately good for business. And at the end of the day, DEI has always been something that's been a business imperative. It is not just to make us feel good. companies have introduced these practices to help the business overall. I think our data shows that companies are still doing the work. They may call it something else. They may cut off the fluff because there were some practices that maybe didn't work so great, but they're keeping the core of it. And I think that's what most stood out to me.
All right. And I think at this point, we're just waiting to see as time goes on if it's evolving for the better. And better could also mean different, right? Exactly like you said. It may not look the way it did 5, 6, 10 years ago, but that doesn't mean the essence of it is being lost, the spirit of it is being lost. And I think what's most important is that we are the ones still carrying that conversation. We cannot let the chatter of the inclusion, the belonging, the fairness, and the DE of it all to like disappear. Once we stop talking about it, then we're doing a disservice to the conversation of making sure people are being treated fairly in the workplace. And so, Kristen, thank you so much for the conversation and honestly just explaining to us what the numbers actually mean and making it an importance and a priority for yourself and the team. Seeing how much you love it makes my heart warm, and obviously putting your work behind it and putting your pen behind your mouth is perfect. I think it's amazing. So seriously, thank you so much for the conversation today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, pleasure's mine. All right, now let's talk about when those numbers meet reality. Latesha, thank you so much for joining me for the conversation today. We yap all the live long day about this offline, but I'm glad to have you on my screen today.
Thanks, Kay. I'm excited to be here.
Okay, perfect. Now, look, you've had a chance to look at the survey. So when you did, what resonated with you when it comes to seeing the work that's happening with your clients based on the data that you saw as well?
It was interesting. Looking at the fact that only 12% of organizations consider DEI a high priority, but 63% said their investment didn't change. That's a little bit conflicting, but that actually does kind of trend with what we're seeing is that a lot of organizations are saying that they're committed. However, the commitment is not fully tangible.
Okay, so what would a tangible commitment look like, and how does that pair with the services that you've been able to provide to execs, to orgs, and the gamut of it?
Yeah. So I think it depends on the organization, right? We really want to help our clients stay away from performative DEI work. And so, employees can feel that. They can feel that in meetings, in town halls, in discussions with their leaders, when they're asking questions, when they're showing up to company events, they can feel that. And so if a leader is saying, hey, we are committed, but they don't see that in the day to day, it's just a miss. And so what does tangible DEI work look like? For one, you don't want DEI to be a standalone initiative. Right. And what I'm seeing a lot of organizations do and how we're helping our clients is to make DEI more embedded across the entire organization, right? Figuring out where what I like to call those like inclusion leaks or gaps and seeing how we can fill that in. So where is inclusion? Where is equity? Where is belonging or whatever they feel comfortable with saying? Where do we feel that the most? Where do we feel that the least? And how do we make sure that support is there, but also tying that to, mission, vision, values, business goals. And, like you and Kristen were discussing just a few minutes ago, like the business case is there. We have moved beyond the business case of the why it's important, but saying that it's important and not doing the work is just simply not enough.
I guess I'm curious though, because why wouldn't we want the DEI to be its own standalone initiative? I definitely hear the pros of like having it embedded in the DNA of the business, but I don't know. I would just assume like my first thought would be, no, we want it to be its own standalone. And I know there are probably a ton of HR professionals listening or watching thinking, well, dang, I thought that we wanted it to stand on its own 2 feet, but it seems like you have a thought that may speak to why you think that might not be the best space.
Yeah. And that's a good question. Let me explain that a little bit more, right? Because let's talk about what it looks like when it is a standalone initiative. Then that's a difference between like an initiative and a standalone function.
Okay.
Those are two different things. So when we talk about a standalone initiative, it's like having a annual culture day, right? And then we don't talk about culture at all. Or when we have those celebratory months that recognize, heritage, we really say like Black History Month, right? Last month, this month is Women's History Month. We're saying, yes, we support Black employees. We support the culture. We support our women employees, but we are Black 365 days of the year. We are women 365 days of the year. So what does that look like beyond some of that programmatic, efforts, right? When I talk about a standalone function, that is something that I do believe in, because there does need to be someone at the organization that is running that, whether that's someone that is in HR, whether that's someone that is outside of HR, and that's a whole different discussion we could get into, because there's a lot of opinions on that. However, the challenge that I've seen is in talking with DEI leaders in the last few years, they don't have visibility with leadership, or leadership doesn't have visibility to the work that they're doing. They don't have budget control. They don't have the budget at all.
Period. Yeah.
They don't want that person to just be the face of it, but they actually have no influence, right? They're not able to create change. They're being really micromanaged, but they're not able to really like dive deep into how they can make an impact, because that person is just kind of out there, siloed, isolated, with no real way to make like sustainable progress.
Okay, thank you for explaining that, because that makes total sense now that you've broken it down that way. And so where are organizations getting DEI right? Like for the present day of today of the conversation, what does DEI the correct way look like, to your point, that's not performative and just like checking off a box?
Yeah. And every organization is different. I wish I could say that there is one organization that is doing it right. I can give examples of what doing it right could look like, and what we're doing at Perfeqta to kind of help our clients move in that direction. First, it's just understanding like the current state. Like, what are we doing well? What are employees saying that we need? What do leaders care about? So we can kind of connect the dots in all of those facets. And then how do we connect that into different areas such as, pay, representation, hiring, recruiting, a sense of belonging. So really measuring belonging, ensuring that there is more than like an annual employee survey, but there are those, checkpoints, what we call them pulse surveys, happening throughout the year to just kind of keep a pulse on like how employees are feeling their sense of emotional safety and belonging at the organization. So I'm saying all that to say it's more of a journey, right? Some organizations have scaled back a lot, but they're doing the work like quietly. And you do have some organizations that just dismantled it, right? And they just went completely silent, and we're like, wait, are we just not doing it at all? Like the ERGs, we don't have ERGs anymore. Okay, all right, well, I'm just gonna do my work and go home. And so the organizations that are doing it right are looking at it from like, how do we make it sustainable, and how do we build year over year? If we aim for perfection in 6 months or 1 year, we're gonna exhaust ourselves and we're gonna burn everyone out. So what does it look like to make like momentum that is, just in a healthy way. And the other thing I would say is getting buy-in from leadership is so important. And making sure that there is engagement or buy-in even from the employees as well, because this work really can't make waves if the employees aren't really feeling the impact of it. If your employees are able to feel the impact of it, the goal is that will help the employees perform better, retains talent, hopefully retain customers, clients, whatever the, company's goals are. So it ultimately would be a win-win for everyone, and everyone understands the why.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's given that you're the Olivia Pope of DEI. Like, you come in and you deal with like the crisis management of like organizations.
It's handled.
Okay, and it is every time, especially when Latesha come through the door. But exactly like you said just a few seconds ago, like you want to talk about like, yeah, do the thing in the month that it's like, I guess, assigned to, but you want momentum. Like, you don't want it to be just like a point in time. And so for you at Perfeqta, being the CEO and the person in charge and the brains behind it, what do you do though to like make it sustainable? Because exactly like you said, it's one thing to come in and like show the work, and it's like, yeah, you can do these things, but after 6 months, after 9 months or even a year. Hopefully you're on retainer. Let's put that on the books. But okay, fingers, eyes, and toes crossed. But truly, how can we make it a thing where it's almost like becoming its own living and breathing organism, and it continues to have efficacy?
Yeah. And, I do want to say, like, I really want our team at Perfeqta to work ourselves out of a job, right? Like, our clients don't need us forever. That is not the goal. And so I'm grateful for our clients that do see the long-term benefit of having a partner that can help to push them along and keep that, momentum going. But to answer your question, we look at a few different areas. The first one that I'll talk about is like governance. So do you have a team? Do you have people that are helping to carry this work out? That could look like a council, a committee, a governing body, essentially, that is there to help make decisions, that is there to help, give feedback or get feedback, kind of having a real feedback loop. And then ultimately also being able to help execute and streamline these efforts like across the business. The other aspect is communication. And so, there's no strategy, no program is really going to work without a strong communications plan. So keeping employees, keeping everyone informed, throughout. Also like being okay to say, hey, we are still figuring this out as well, but we want you to come on this journey with us and help us get to where we're trying to go. And so, that's one area that I've seen work really, really well, because then that allows everyone to say, okay, I see what my company is doing. They're making efforts to get this right. And, oh, I'm valued here. They care about my feedback. They care about, my experience. The other piece is really around like that engagement, so like from a momentum perspective, what does that programmatic effort actually look like? It shouldn't be once a year, right? But what does that look like throughout the year? And having ongoing efforts that do bring different employees in. We're engaging with everyone, of course, engaging with allies, engaging with leaders. Like, how can we engage everyone at the company in a way that is meaningful to them? So those are just a few ways. I could go kind of, on and on about it.
Okay, but the point of the matter is there are options. There are things that can be done. That's not just one specific way. I think to your point, it just matters on the culture of the company, the client that you're working with. There's a bunch of tools you can pull from the toolbox.
Exactly. Yeah. There's a lot of different ways, and no company is the same. There's no one size, fits all. And so, really understanding what's important to the org, but also like what is, again, that vision, that mission, what are your values? But also what is the change that you want to see? We do have that freedom, or that, our perspectives really matter to bring that in as well. But yeah, every company is definitely different, even for our nonprofit clients that we work with. We work with a lot of nonprofits. They really care about their community. How do we support our community? How do we support our volunteers? For our tech clients, right? They care about innovation, right? And so there are ways to really bring, DEI into how do we make sure we are being innovative, whether that's in our product design or whether that's in how we are communicating our tools to our customers. So that's why it just, depends on the industry, company size, so on and so forth.
Yeah, you mentioned that governance. That was like your first point, actually, like being one of the things that can help DEI be sustainable. And when you use the word governance, it made me think of government, which makes me think of politics. Okay,
Yeah.
So we can't pretend that obviously politics has nothing to do with the conversation of DEI today, especially given our current, administration. And so, in your opinion, how can HR leaders, HR professionals prevent their DEI strategies from being politically reactive, whether it's with whoever's sitting in, that seat now or the next election, whatever the situation is? How can you make it reactive proof?
Yeah. I think that's an interesting question, because I don't know if any of this work is ever like reactive proof.
Okay.
DEI has definitely been in the news a lot in the last few years, but even prior to, 2020, I know Kristen even brought up like when Reagan was in office, right? It's always been an industry that has had a lot of opinions or perspectives, on it. And so keeping it from becoming politically reactive, one is not making DEI like a PR stunt.
Period.
And so when you are saying you are committed to this work, tying that to, of course, the business case with being very intentional about the language that's being used. Many of our clients, I will say some of our clients are like, nope, it's DEI all day long, period.
Oh, I love that.
Some of them are, right? Some of them are adding in the belonging because that is what they're finding is most important. We've been really helping them hone in on like, how do you want to define it, when you're going through this rebrand? What's going to resonate with your employees, but also what is going to keep you like legally or risk averse, right? This is where I recommend to talk to your legal counsel, general counsel. But if it does require a reframing in language, it gives us an opportunity to like just reset and rethink, like, how do we talk about this work without actually using those words? It allows us to get creative. It allows us to come up with fun terms that are more relevant to our culture and how, are tied to our values, right? So there's a lot of opportunities there, but always anchor it to, your company instead of focusing so much on those actual, 3 words. The other thing I'll say is just documenting your stuff. So like, for example, for, companies that are focused or were focused on equitable hiring, right? Or inclusive hiring. The goal was never to exclude groups. It was to include more groups that have been historically excluded. And so just if the work is being done right, it is not being done in a way that is being publicized, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
And so, just being really smart with like the why behind it, what we're trying to accomplish. And then of course, like tweaking the language if necessary.
Okay, fair enough. But like when you're working with a client as well, like or auditing what it is that they're doing, is there like a red flag that you're like, oh, this is like immediately something that we need to jump on and like rectify? Do you see like typical things of like those red flags, or is it more like, to your point, in certain instances where it's like it's nuanced and you're seeing like a myriad of different things that fits into that?
Yeah, I would say when there's so many red flags.
They just waving. The red flag.
I'm telling you, it's Six Flags out here.
Not Six Flags, I'm screaming. But one of the 6, give me an example, please, just so for those who are listening, they're like,
let me just think of just one.
Yeah.
I feel like I've already said one, so I'm not going to say that one again.
That's fine.
But if we can't point to anyone at the org that is responsible for leading it. Right? Even as a practitioner or as a partner, when we're coming in to support clients, it's, we still need a leader here to actually be able to set the strategy, but like execute on the plan, right? They're going to need support. They're going to need help. We need somebody. The challenge that I'm seeing now, specifically this year and last year alone, is so many heads of DEI, chief diversity roles have completely gone away. We've seen DEI teams pretty much get like let go in a very, very short amount of time. And the challenge there is that, without having someone leading it, it's who's truly responsible for it. We might say ERGs. Look at our ERGs. But these ERG leaders already have full-time jobs and they're doing this, maybe at 8:00 at night or Saturday morning, whenever they can get to it. And that's a lot of pressure and weight on ERG. So that would probably be my first thing is if we're just pointing to our ERGs and not pointing to, how that shows up in product, how that shows up in working with customers, how that shows up in other areas, that is definitely a red flag. And I'm I do want to just call out the fact that there's nothing, well, I don't want to say there's nothing wrong with red flags, but being honest about what you are doing or not doing as a partner will allow us to help with the solution. We can't come in and you think you might need this, but then we see that there's a lot of other things that you don't have or you aren't doing. So the more forthcoming and honest you can be about that, the more we can solve for those things. Red flags typically don't, I would say, like scare me or keep me from working with a company. Okay. It's more so this is an opportunity to help them grow, right?
Yeah. Well, look, that's why I'm wearing red today. I want y'all to know that having a red flag it's a safe space for you to talk to an HR person about the said flag. But exactly to your point, it's like, let's work on changing that red to green, right? Let's put the work behind it. Let's put the effort behind it. And it was so interesting to kind of hear how Kristen was like sharing the numbers of the survey. And then Latesha, you being fabulous and really just explaining how the numbers are one thing, but how does it show up in the day-to-day, and you being an expert in that field and giving consultation to all these different execs and companies and organizations and how it makes sense. And so I asked a version of this question to Kristen before, but I'm curious to know your final thought of what would be like a word or a sentence of how you would describe the state of DEI today.
I want to take Kristen's word.
Okay, and it's fair. We can share it. And that word for you is evolving.
No, I'm not going to take her word. Now I got to think of another one. I will say that it is, what is it when like a caterpillar turns into a butterfly?
Metamorphosis?
Is that what they do?
Caterpillars do turn into butterflies.
Okay.
Is that what they do? Yes, in their spare time. I think that's metamorphosis.
Yeah, we're blooming. Yeah. We are resetting, I am still very excited and optimistic about the work. I'm honest about where we are. But as long as companies have people that think, look, talk, act differently, this work is always going to be really important. And so I think it's just blossoming. I'm looking forward to seeing how it continues to change in this time. But yeah, that's kind of what I think about it.
And that's very poetic, very factual, and very beautiful, honestly. So Latesha, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with me today. And the conversation, I hope, is one of many more, whether it's us working together again, us yapping on this conversation for the podcast. But thank you for your time in the conversation overall about DEI and why it still matters.
Thank you so much, Kate.
And with that being said, the survey shows that DEI isn't a trend. It's not a headline, and it's not a quarterly initiative. It's infrastructure. Kristen gave us the data, Latesha gave us the application, and if there's one thing this episode makes clear, is that the work doesn't disappear just because the conversation just got a little bit quieter. So to the HR leaders listening, this is your moment to decide whether DEI is embedded in how your organization operates or if it's just going to live inside a slide deck. I think we both know what the right answer is. In any case, thank you to Kristen Parisi from HR Brew and Latesha from Perfeqta for bringing both insight and accountability into this conversation. And to you who are listening, if you are curious to know a bit more about our survey, the link is in the show notes. And outside of that, if you have any thoughts to share, pass them through at peopleperson@morningbrew.com. I'll at y'all later.